Boyd Peterson. I'm the program coordinator for Mormon Studies here at UVU. And this is our 2015 conference is on Mormonism and Catholicism. And I'd just like to start by mentioning an incident that happened years ago in Sweden. The LDS Church was trying to build a temple in Stockholm, and there was a lot of opposition that was happening at the time. And Krister Stendal, who's a bishop there, he was a bishop of Stockholm at the time, he responded to the opposition and gave 3 rules for religious understanding. And he said, first of all, when trying to understand another religion, you should ask the adherents of that religion, not its enemies. The second rule was don't compare your best to their worst. And the third rule was that you should leave room for holy envy. And in that spirit, what we're trying to do here at UVU is to follow all of those. We've got today a group of people who are part of both religions, who represent both religions in some way. They're adherents, faithful participants in those religions. They're going to be doing some comparisons, and I promise you they're going to be comparing best to best and worst to worst. And I think in the spirit of this, we'll all find room for holy envy of each other's traditions. Our first speaker today is Matt Groh, and I just realized I left his bio down in the stand. Matt currently works for the LDS Church History Department, and his book on Thomas Cain was an important work. Oxford University Press, is that right, Matt? Yale, Oxford, same thing. And he co-wrote with Terrell Givens the biography of Parley P. Pratt, which did come out through Oxford. So that's why I got that. Please welcome Matt Groh.
Well, good morning. Boyd asked that I dust off an article I wrote about a decade ago that was published in the Journal of Church History that I titled The Whore of Babylon and the Abomination of Abominations, 19th-Century Catholic and Mormon Mutual Perceptions and Religious Identity. So where Boyd suggested that we were going to ask the adherents, not the enemies, to describe the groups in question, that does not describe my paper. Rather, I'm going to let what the groups who were 19th century enemies describe each other. I wrote the paper when I was a graduate student at Notre Dame. And I thought, well, being a Mormon at Notre Dame, this might be a fun topic to explore in a seminar class I had there with an intellectual historian named Jim Turner. I also thought it was interesting that in last week's general conference, to hear the sort of rhetoric or the statements about Catholicism that were made in that venue. I'll be reading some other statements from General Conference from 150 years ago. But I haven't done the research, but it would be my guess that this was the first time that a pope and an archbishop were both quoted at some length in General Conference, as well as the story of Mother Teresa was told by another speaker. And I think that gives some indication of how far the dialogue has come between Mormons and Catholics, certainly a much different universe than the one that I'll be talking about in the 19th century. My paper will be talking about perceptions between the groups, not the relations that actually occurred on the ground. And it's too bad that Gary Topping won't be able to be with us because he's done a lot of research that has shown that on the ground in places like 19th century Utah, there were pretty amicable relations between Mormons and Catholics. I want to start off by telling a quick story of Orrin Bronson. In 1846, Orrin, who was the older brother of the famous Catholic convert Orestes Bronson, penned a letter to his brother recounting a dream that Orestes had earlier shared with him. In the dream, Orestes, Oren, and a third brother Daniel were traveling a road together. You first left the road, then myself, and it remains to be seen whether Daniel shall turn out of the road or change his opinion, Oren wrote. During the same period in which Orestes converted to Catholicism, because no other church possessed proper authority, Oren joined the Latter-day Saints, because he believed that proper authority rests among the Mormons. In an era characterized by denominational proliferation and competition, Catholic and Mormon claims to authority proved appealing to some Americans, like the Bronsons, wearied by the disunity of the Protestant world. Oren cautioned Orestes to not trust polemical literature against the Mormons. Orestes could have repeated the same warning about Catholicism, given the number of 19th century attacks on both Catholics and Mormons. Leaving mainstream Christianity to join the most despised religions in 19th century America, the Bronson brothers embarked on spiritual quests that few contemporary Americans would have understood. Their exchange not only suggests similarities in the appeal of Mormonism and Catholicism to some Americans, but also raises the question of how Latter-day Saints and Catholics viewed each other. The relationship of Mormons and Catholics is an intriguing case of the dynamics between religious groups on the margins rather than in the mainstream, because Protestant writings often link them as enemies of Republican America. Recent historians of the 19th century reactions of the American public to Catholicism and Mormonism have emphasized how each group came to be viewed as a demonized other. So I thought I'd investigate, how does one other respond to another other? Or how do these groups on the margins respond to each other? And what are they doing in their rhetoric about each other? Religious groups outside of the mainstream feel competing poles towards accommodation to the culture or differentiation from it. The relative weight given to either adjustment to or separation from the mainstream reveals much about the internal life of a religious group. While they borrowed from the Protestant critiques of the other religion, Catholic and Mormons also transformed the discourse about each other to reinforce crucial trends within their own community. In writing about Catholicism, Mormons sought to establish an identity distinct from both Protestants and Catholics. In contrast, in their efforts to move into the mainstream, Catholics use their descriptions of Mormonism to break free from stereotypes with which Protestants tarred both religions. First, let's talk a little bit about how 19th century Protestants describe Mormons and Catholics. They use similar arguments against both groups, denouncing both as dangerous to American values. Depictions of both groups rested on a dichotomy between a group of sinister and unscrupulous leaders and the deceived rank-and-file members, who, though innocent, would unquestioningly obey their superiors. The perception of group cohesion led to charges of block voting, and the frequently raised specter of the temporal ambitions of the religious hierarchies evoked fears of theocracy. Supposed secret and sinister rituals further defined the groups as un-American. Their reliance on immigrants provoked fears of an influx of foreigners who would subvert American democracy. Finally, using the genre of the captivity narrative, authors describe the exploitation of women in convents and in polygamy. Let's see. Significantly, 19th century writers often explicitly compared the two religions. As you can see here in this Thomas Nash political cartoon, Thomas Nash was probably the most prominent political cartoon in the late 19th century. And here we have the Roman Church and the Mormon Church crawling on top of the Capitol. Right? Religious liberty is guaranteed, but can we allow foreign reptiles to crawl all over us, the U.S.? Yeah, I can. Did I lose some of the... Okay, so religious liberty is guaranteed, but can we allow foreign reptiles to crawl all over us? And of course, the Mormon Church snapping turtle has shades of the tabernacle. in Salt Lake City. And this is sort of a common theme to tie them together. In his best-selling work in the 1880s, Josiah Strong, in our country, similarly compared the two as perils endangering American life, pointing to their political power, the immigrant populations, their socialistic doctrines. He declared that the Mormon leader outpopes the Roman, a common charge against Brigham Young and other Mormon prophets. The equation of Catholicism and Mormonism as groups that threatened American liberty sets the context for their perceptions of each other. So let's talk a little bit about Mormons on Catholics. I'll be quoting from both of these men. Mormons initially described Catholicism in language nearly indistinguishable from that used by their Protestant friends and families. Largely drawn from the ranks of disaffected Protestants, early Mormon converts lived in a world inundated with anti-Catholicism. Since the Reformation, Protestants had associated the Catholic Church with the imagery in the biblical book of Revelation of Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. The whore of Babylon was widely used as a label for the Catholic Church. Mormon scripture contains imagery similar to the statements in Revelation. In a vision, the first prophet in the Book of Mormon saw the formation of a church which is most abominable above all other churches, that destroyed the saints of God, stripped the Bible of many parts which are plain and most precious, and worshipped the gold, and the silver, and the silks, and the scarlets, and the fine twined linen, and the precious clothing, and the harlots. Early Mormons often identified this church as the Catholic Church. The narrative of Mormon sacred history reinforced the anti-Catholic tendencies of early Mormons. Latter-day Saints viewed Christian history as consisting primarily of three pivotal events: the establishment of the primitive Christian church, a great apostasy in which corrupt Catholicism stamped out pure Christianity, and the restoration of Christ's church through Joseph Smith. An early Mormon pamphleteer declared that nothing can be more plain than the identification of the scriptural whore of Babylon with the Roman or Latin church. Latter-day Saints continued to associate Catholicism with the whore of Babylon throughout the 19th century, and indeed into the 20th, particularly in the writings of missionaries. After about 6 months of preaching the wickedness of the Catholic abominations in Chile in 1851, Apostle Parley P. Pratt blamed the failure of his mission on the power of the mother, of the great mother of abominations. Pratt and other missionaries had cause for complaint, as the few converts gleaned from Catholic nations paled in comparison to the harvest won by their missionary colleagues in Protestant areas. Missions to Catholic countries, including France, Italy, Ireland, Chile, and Mexico, were largely dismal failures from a Mormon view. Nevertheless, in contrast to this identification of Catholicism as the whore of Babylon, other Latter-day Saints shifted their rhetoric during the mid-19th century. Apostle Orson Pratt, younger brother, advocated that both Catholics and Protestants are nothing less than the whore of Babylon. While stating that the devil founded the Catholic Church, Pratt emphasized that Protestant churches, as daughters of the great harlot, likewise possess no authority. John Taylor, the church's third president, echoed this imagery. The Protestants believe the Catholics are all in error and pack the whole church off to hell as the mother of harlots without any trouble or without even a sigh. And the old mother is just as uncharitable towards her daughters, for they are her offspring, and she sends the whole of them unceremoniously to the same place. So you can see we've come a distance in our rhetoric. While the trend towards a widening definition of the whore of Babylon was not exclusive, condemnations of Catholicism would continue within Mormon thought, coexisting with this expanding interpretation. It indicates the Mormon desire to further separate from traditional Christianity, from not just Catholicism, but from Protestantism as well. As the national campaign to crush polygamy intensified in the 1870s and 1880s, Latter-day Saint leaders further broadened the definition of the great and abominable church to include American society. One writer questioned, who shall decide which is the man of sin, the Roman Church or the Protestant Christian nation of the United States? George Cannon, a powerful religious and political leader, identified efforts to suppress Mormon power by American politicians with the Whore of Babylon. So this expanding interpretation of what the Whore of Babylon was, from Catholicism to traditional Christianity to American society, indicates the trajectory of Mormonism in the 19th century, as Mormons constructed an identity that emphasized the differences between their religious community and the mainstream culture. And the rhetoric of the Whore of Babylon was one weapon in the Latter-day Saint arsenal in constructing this boundary. So now let's talk about Catholics on Mormons. The perceptions of Mormons by Catholics during the mid-1800s can be usefully viewed through three Catholic writers who represented diverse segments of the American Church: Father Samuel Mazzucchelli, the Jesuit missionary Pierre-Jean de Smet, and Orestes Bronson. Writing in a cultural atmosphere that already associated the two churches together as enemies of America, these writers sharply differentiated Catholicism from Mormonism. Their writings date primarily from the 1850s, when the rapid rise of the Know-Nothings corresponded with an increase in anti-Catholic sentiment among Americans at large. They argued that Mormonism, not Catholicism, was a proper target for the political attacks aimed at Catholics. An Italian-born cleric, Dominican, who worked among both Indians and whites in the Midwest, Mazzucchelli visited Nauvoo, Illinois in 1843 to meet Joseph Smith. He subsequently contributed articles on Mormonism to American Catholic newspapers and included a description of the Latter-day Saints in his memoirs, first published in Italy in 1846. Mazzucchelli used his writings on Mormonism as a means to critique the sectarianism of the Protestant world and argue that Catholicism provided protection from such fanaticism. For him, Mormonism was Protestantism run amok, the extreme culmination of Protestant sectarianism. But of what are men not capable outside the Catholic Church, he asked. The Jesuit missionary Pierre-Jean de Smet, a native of Belgium who became renowned for his missionary labors among American Indians, argued that Mormons were unsuitable in American society. He had sympathized with the Latter-day Saints after he had met with Brigham Young following the Mormon expulsion from Nauvoo in 1846. By 1858, however, he'd been recruited to join the United States Army on a mission to Utah during the so-called Utah War. While he never reached the territory, his opinions on the Mormons had radically changed. The creation of a Mormon theocracy in Utah and the highly publicized clash between Mormon leaders and federal officials, in his view, transformed the Mormons into a threatening menace. Using the language of republicanism that Know-Nothings had used against Catholics, de Smet warned of the Saints. They have a political system that is inadmissible in a republic, and a religious system still less admissible, which is the abomination of abominations. Orestes Bronson also perpetuated stereotypes of Mormonism for a Catholic audience. He was the most renowned religious seeker of 19th century America, passing through several movements before converting to Catholicism in 1844. Like his brother Orrin, apparently at one time he had also explored Mormonism. In 1854, Bronson, by now the premier American Catholic liberal, turned his attention to Mormonism in The Spirit Rapper, a fictionalized autobiography. Bronson's narrator claimed to have known Joseph Smith and have intimate knowledge of the Latter-day Saints, as for a considerable amount of time the Mormon prophets and elders were in the habit of visiting my house. Bronson associated Mormonism with spiritualism and mesmerism. The narrator admitted the reality of Mormon miracles, though he attributed them to direct satanic intervention, asserting that Mormonism is literally the synagogue of Satan. Like de Smet, Bronson believed that Mormon reason and conscience are incompatible with the maintenance of the American state. Though unlike de Smet, Bronson believed that government should protect Mormons' freedom of religion. In my original paper, this is where I took a little interlude to talk about Mormon and Catholic relations in late 19th century Utah, particularly looking at the leader of Utah Catholics, Lawrence Scanlon, who fostered a very positive environment with Brigham Young and John Taylor and other leaders. So the rhetoric existed at one level, but sort of the interpersonal relations existed at quite another level. So if you want to read more about that, you'll have to read Gary Topping's articles on it. So we have Mazzucchelli and Desmet and Bronson, who established themes for Catholic authors that were then repeated in the late 19th century by other authors who adopted a militant stance toward Mormonism. While Catholics usually criticize Protestants on religious issues, their critique of the Latter-day Saints focused on politics and morality. A number of articles on Mormonism appeared in mainstream Catholic journals such as Catholic World and the American Quarterly Catholic Review from the 1870s to the 1890s. They suggest two differences between Catholic perceptions of Mormonism and mainstream Protestant views of the Latter-day Saints. First, Catholic writers echoed Mazzucchelli in noting the absence of Mormons with Catholic backgrounds and in claiming that Catholicism blocked the appeal of Mormonism. Mormon converts were described as the lowest grades of non-Catholic nations, and Spaniards, Italians, French, Irish, Mexicans are sought in vain among the Latter-day Saints. Only Catholicism was capable of protecting souls from this stupendous parody on things decent, fitting, and spiritual. Second, while most depictions of the Latter-day Saints focus on the evils of polygamy, Catholic writers concentrated on the abuses of theocratic power. Much more frequently than their Protestant counterparts, Catholic writers drew on political stereotypes of Mormons, portraying the saints as undemocratic, disloyal to the federal government, and under the tyranny of Brigham Young and other leaders. Routinely criticized for their own authoritarian leadership and their own disloyalty to America, Catholic writers harshly condemned the Mormon political system. Catholic historian John Gilmary Shea groaned that Mormonism has thriven under the neglect of our federal government, till it is so strong as to defy all attempts to punish its disregard and defiance of laws. Another writer suggested that under Mormon rule, suffrage became the veriest sham, as both dead saints and Mormon livestock regularly went to the polls. Catholic authors also highlighted Mormon disloyalty to the federal government, particularly during the Utah War and the Civil War. Like Mormons, Catholics had to confront their own ambiguous response to the Civil War, which in the North comprised both the heroism of the Irish Brigade and the New York City draft riots, and the common charge that allegiance to the Pope trumped loyalty to the American government. One Catholic writer charged that Mormons were chronic rebels to the flag that protected them, citing a supposed quote by Brigham Young during the Civil War. The North prays for the destruction of the South, and the South prays for the destruction of the North. And I say amen to both prayers. Catholic writers also denounced polygamy, but unlike Protestants, they generally did not dwell on it. And their critiques of Mormon politics dwarfed their discussion of polygamy. This Catholic emphasis on Mormon politics contrasts with the general image of Mormonism, which focused by contrast on polygamy. But Catholic authors, themselves striving to demonstrate the compatibility of Catholicism and American democracy, amid intense nativist sentiment that depicted Catholics as un-American foreigners, emphasized the political side of the Mormon question. So how can this Catholic penchant for denouncing politics rather than polygamy as the primary Mormon sin be explained? And more importantly, why should anyone care? Why would this be of interest to anyone besides narrow specialists in the history of Mormonism and Catholicism? Cultural historians have used this concept of the other to examine how a dominant group develops an identity by reducing a minority or foreign group to a stereotyped other representing the antithesis of the dominant group's core values. The vast outpouring of venomous literature aimed at Catholics and Latter-day Saints suggests that both groups functioned in this way for mainstream Americans. Catholics and Mormons thus face a similar dilemma of how to respond to their image as foreign, subversive agents unfit for American society. Their responses suggest the range of possibilities for a marginalized religious minority. For most of the 19th century, Catholics and Mormons were on fundamentally different trajectories, as Latter-day Saints sought to maintain their separation from American society, and most Catholics desired either acceptance by or integration with the American political system and culture. The Saints sought to establish a culturally autonomous region in Utah that would be separate from American society and culture. The campaign against polygamy in Mormon politics strengthened the development of an enclave mentality among the Saints. Their desire to develop distinct boundaries between the community of the Saints and the outside world, I think, led to this extension of the Whore of Babylon imagery from just Catholics to all Christians to American society. A vigorous debate over how to balance the competing claims of cultural accommodation and differentiation occurred within 19th century American Catholics. Liberal Catholics asserted the need to adapt the church to its American environment. Conservatives countered by advocating cultural separation, though they also argued for the compatibility of Catholicism and American democracy. Legions of American critics, however, portrayed Catholicism as opposed to core American political principles. Facing this onslaught, many Catholics renewed their efforts to become mainstream Americans. The Catholic condemnations of Mormons as essentially an American should be seen as a tactic within this larger campaign to establish the American credentials of Catholicism. In short, Catholics and Mormons used their perceptions of each other to further the internal goals of their own community, and hopefully suggesting this sort of pattern in which marginalized religious and ethnic groups utilize the stereotypes of other ethnic groups, other religious groups, to advance their strategies for how to relate to the mainstream culture. Well, it's been a lot of fun to revisit this, and I think we're going to save any questions for a little bit later.
Thanks, Matt. So as Matt said, Gary Topping was not able to make it today. He had a small accident. He's doing well, but he sends his regrets. Fortunately for us, we have a pitch hitter. So Bradley Keim is going to speak to us now. He's completing a master's degree at Utah State University with Phil Barlow, and is starting a PhD program in the fall at the University of Virginia with Kathleen Flake. He's worked at the LDS Church History Department, and his thesis is on Mormon-Catholic interactions and views of each other from the 1830s to 1920s. Please welcome Bradley Keim.
Thanks. All right, glad to be here. Got a phone call from Matt Groh late last night, and distilled as much as I could of my thesis research into 10 pages before driving down here early this morning. So I'm really excited to share this with you, though. My thesis research is actually a little bit broader. It's on how Catholics used a whole bunch of religious outsiders like Mormons as rhetorical ammunition against mainstream Protestants. And I'm kind of distilling the Catholic Mormon component of that here, but the context, the wider array of religious outsiders is an important part of the point that I'm going to make here. I'm going to build on some of the same dynamics that Matt just talked about. I think, as he kind of illustrated, Mormon and Catholic relations and responses to each other don't make a ton of sense except in reference to their respective responses to mainstream Protestantism. All those dynamics have to be taken into account together. So I'm going to focus on the Catholic voices, and I'm culling these Catholic voices from 33 different Catholic periodicals, articles published in those periodicals from 1830 to 1930, several dozen books and pamphlets, but mainly those periodicals that span regions across the United States and the the conservative liberal spectrum across that spectrum. Okay, so Matt has made a compelling case for why and how Catholics used Mormons to appeal to and deflect criticism from the Protestant American mainstream in the 19th century. I'm going to make a case for the prevalence of the opposite impulse. Many American Catholics, liberal and conservative, used Mormonism to critique Protestantism and to contest the criteria that lay behind Protestant anti-Catholicism. In other words, many Catholics used Mormonism to interrogate the Americanness of Protestants rather than trying to prove their own Americanness on Protestant terms. So it makes sense that American Catholicism would exhibit both of these impulses, the ones Matt talks about and the ones that I'm going to talk about. Religious insiders and outsiders in American history built the boundaries between the mainstream and the margins together. And many outsiders, especially Mormons and Catholics, have throughout their histories both prophetically rejected and pragmatically regarded the American religious mainstream. Both impulses have coexisted or competed for preeminence within these complex religious communities from period to period, from context to context, from person to person. Latter-day Saints can surely see that within their own faith, even in these major periods marked as critical of American culture and more accommodating to American culture. Grant Underwood wrote an incredible article in the Pacific Historical Quarterly back in the 80s, kind of making a similar point, but on a broader scale. Okay, so what I offer here is a wider purview for the Catholic response to Mormonism from 1830 to 1930. There's a lot to be gained by looking at Catholic responses to Mormonism in its own right. And there's a lot to be gained by looking, as I will here, at Catholic commentary on the whole constellation of radical religious and irreligious outsiders that lit up America's long 19th century. Of these, Mormonism was the most salient and sinister, but Catholics constantly talked about Mormons and Millerites, atheists and agnostics, spiritualists and Christian Scientists in the same breath or in the same terms. Am I talking too loud? Okay. To such Catholics, Mormons and other outsiders were the products of Protestant private interpretation. They were parodies of Catholic authority and truth, compensating for Protestant paucities, and proof of both Protestant credulity and incredulity. Most importantly, Protestant reactions to these outsiders, especially Mormons, in the view of Catholics, exposed the intolerance, incoherence, and insufficiency of the informal Protestant establishment and the anti-Catholic discourse that legitimized that informal establishment. So that ubiquitous anti-Catholic discourse cast the Catholic Church as the oppressor of exegetical freedom, intellectual freedom, and religious freedom by contextualizing Mormonism among America's myriad marginalized religious groups. Catholic commentary on Mormonism appears as a counter-critique of these pervasive Protestant portrayals of their own liberation from Catholic oppression. Instead of using Mormonism to affirm their affinity for American exegetical, intellectual, and religious freedom, many Catholics use Mormonism to prove that Protestantism undermined those American freedoms by producing, proliferating, and then persecuting religious and irreligious outsiders. So, with the time I have, I'm just going to briefly touch on 7 specific strategies by which Catholics mounted this critique of Protestantism in America from 1830 to 1930. So first and most obviously, and Matt actually mentioned an example of this from Samuel Mazzucchelli. First and most obviously, Catholics cast figures like Smith and movements like Mormonism as the inevitable fanaticism unleashed by Protestant private interpretation of the Bible. Phrases like, quote, this new class of Bible readers, this latest phase of Protestantism, or this striking example of the Protestant principle of private interpretation accompanied countless Catholic descriptions of Mormons, Transcendentalists, Seventh-day Adventists, Christian Scientists, and others. Protestants were aware of this. So when Protestants tried to deny that these groups were the product of Protestantism, Catholics pushed back. Protestants famously distanced themselves from Mormonism, for example, by describing polygamy as, quote, a relic of barbarism. This rhetoric of alienation, carefully analyzed by Spencer Fluman, identified polygamous Mormons as a throwback to African and Asiatic tribes, and therefore as both historically and culturally foreign. Mormons were, in Protestant discourse, an obstacle to national destiny in the West, an anomalous vestige of primitive overseas heathenism. Catholics carefully parsed that kind of Protestant discourse. They agreed that Mormonism was a culturally alien hindrance to national destiny, but they rejected Protestants' historical distancing of Mormonism. Polygamous Mormonism, they argued, quote, is not a relic of anything in our institutions. It is a new development of private judgment in religious matters among us. Mormonism was indeed a stumbling block to Christian civilization, but to Catholics, it was a stumbling block produced by modern Protestantism, not ancient barbarism. So another example here of Protestants trying to distance themselves from Mormons, Catholics rejecting that. When mainstream Protestants accused religious outsiders of imposture, many Catholics again saw an attempt to distance fanaticism from mainstream Protestantism. If outsiders were knowingly deceptive, then the Protestant principle of private interpretation could bear no blame for their existence. Many Catholics countered that radical outsiders interpreted the Bible as sincerely as mainstream Protestants, even outsiders as infamous as the theocrat John Alexander Dowie, who claimed at the turn of the 19th century to be the third incarnation of Elijah. As the Catholic New York Freeman's Journal put it, quote, if from his reading of the New Testament, Dowie is convinced that he is Elijah III, whose mission is to found a new sect, why cannot he justify himself by appealing to the Protestant principle of private interpretation of the Bible? Catholics relentlessly asked the exact same questions of Joseph Smith, William Miller, Mary Baker Eddy, and many others. Their point was that by trading Catholic authority for sola scriptura, Protestants had surrendered any plausible authority to police exegetical boundaries among themselves, which put them at the mercy of the Bible-quoting religious outsiders that private interpretation had produced. So a second strategy was a little less obvious, but almost as prevalent. In this interpretive schema, radical religious outsiders were Catholic parodies, posing as panaceas for what Protestantism lacked. Certainly Catholic dogmas, but especially papal authority, met real human needs as Catholics saw it. But in the vacuum produced by Protestant anti-Catholicism, religious outsiders arose to meet those needs. This is how Catholics saw it. And here's one example. In a widely read 1885 article, John Gilmore Shea, the father of American Catholic Church historians, described how opportunistic prophets stepped in to fill the aching void, as he put it, left by the rejection of papal authority. Shea offered a historical catalog of such prophets in America: Ann Lee, Joseph C. Dilks, Joseph Smith, Robert Matthews, and Myra Mitta, among others. His analysis of their appeal to Americans closely echoed Joseph Smith's own narrative of his prophetic calling. So Latter-day Saints in the audience should recognize this kind of appeal from Joseph Smith's own narratives. Here's what he said: prophets claiming to be recipients of special revelations from the Almighty have constantly appeared in this country and never fail to obtain credulous followers. To the ordinary Protestant, they say, you admit that the Catholic Church has fallen into error, but your ministers all disagree. There is no one to teach the people truth. Open your Bibles. How did God act in such cases? Did he not raise up his prophets to announce his will to the people and lead them back to him? Even such am I. So to Catholics, the emergence of outsiders who aped Roman authority proved that Protestants' supposed exegetical freedom, their liberation of the scriptures, had actually severed them from the source of spiritual satisfaction and safety. All right, third and fourth strategies came in response to American Protestant portrayals of their intellectual freedom. It's not just the freedom of scriptural interpretation, but their intellectual freedom, their progressive education, the enlightened progress of their civilization. A mid-19th century Protestant published in the North American Review gave voice to America's non-Catholic near consensus when he asked, quote, what progress did the mind of man make for the many centuries before Luther proclaimed freedom of thought? So that was kind of the American view, the American Protestant view. Catholics came at such Protestant professions of intellectual liberation from two directions. First, Catholics mocked Protestant credulity, and here Mormons more than anybody else came in handy. Always Mormons are showing up as this rhetorical ammunition that Catholics are able to use to mount their long-standing critiques of mainstream Protestantism. So they mocked Protestant credulity. An unending stream of Protestant converts to religious outsider groups, Catholics argued, belied the supposed enlightenment of Protestantism, and by extension, the supposedly superior morality of enlightened Protestant civilization. America's so-called non-sectarian schools, that's what Protestants called their Protestant schools when they were trying to justify them as not violating the separation of church and state. So these non-sectarian schools compounded Protestants' intellectual susceptibility to proselytizing religious radicals, and as Catholics saw it, if that susceptibility was any indication, the Reformation could hardly be described as it was by so many American Protestants as the liberation of the mind from the dark ages of Christendom. One Catholic commentator noted the multitudes of Protestants who had followed Mary Baker Eddy and John Alexander Dowie, and then scoffed, quote, "Yet we are told we have left the so-called dark ages." Likewise, in 1858, the future Archbishop of Baltimore, Martin John Spalding, asked, quote, "Can we wonder that Mormonism made so many recruits to its foul ranks in England and Wales? This thoroughly reformed and enlightened country, which has for 3 centuries been boasting its superior civilization and sneering at its less fortunate because priest-ridden neighbors, constituted a fitting theater for the zeal of the Mormon apostles. In wry contrast, quote, Catholic Ireland, France, Belgium, Italy, and Spain were not yet sufficiently enlightened to turn Mormon. This, to Spalding, was, quote, incontestable evidence of the superior moral tone of Catholic countries over those whose people are forever boasting their superior enlightenment because of their having embraced the glorious Reformation. Mormonism's successes among Protestants suggested to Catholics that the Reformation had neither enlightened the mind nor civilized society, and the proliferation and growth of radical religious outsider groups, Catholics argued, fit oddly into American Protestant historical narratives of intellectual liberation and progress since the Reformation. So, none of these obviously are new positions for Catholics in the 19th century. Their position on scripture and authority and faith and reason hadn't changed. The point here is that disestablishment, denominationalism, all these new circumstances in the 19th century and all these new fanatical religious groups were giving them new rhetorical ammunition, and Mormons especially, they took advantage of to mount these long-standing critiques against Protestants. So that's Protestant credulity, but Catholics also noted a Protestant tendency toward extreme skepticism, certainly as an inherent proclivity of liberal Protestantism, but also as a reaction to the theological chaos produced by private interpretation and propelled by religious outsiders. Catholics ultimately considered Protestant credulity and incredulity to be mutually reinforcing intellectual consequences of the Reformation. Sectarianism and supernaturalism pushed thoughtful Protestants toward atheistic rationalism in droves, and the consequent climate of skepticism provoked more outbursts of compensatory supernaturalism and chaotic sectarianism. Most prominently, Catholics used Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, and guys like Robert Ingersoll, the great agnostic, to mark these two sides of Protestant intellectual insufficiency. Okay, so moving on to Protestant responses to Mormons that Catholics noted. To Catholics, Protestant responses to religious and irreligious outsiders were even more damning than the fact that Protestantism had produced those outsiders in the first place. Catholics' fifth strategy for critiquing Protestantism in America centered simply on Protestant intolerance. Rather than preserving the particularity of their own mistreatment by Protestants, Catholics connected anti-Catholic incidents, like the burning of the Charlestown Convent in Boston, to the hanging of Quakers by Puritans, to the blasphemy trials of freethinkers like Abner Kneeland, and to the Protestant paroxysms over Mormon apostle Reed Smoot's seating in the U.S. Senate. They did so in order to prove a general pattern of Protestant intolerance. Catholics argued that if anti-Catholicism was part and parcel of Protestant reactions to other religious outsiders, from Quakers to freethinkers to Mormons, then it became less convincing to claim, as Protestants did, that anti-Catholicism was simply a necessary protective against Catholicism's special threat to religious freedom. The Protestant reactions provoked by Mormons and other outsiders thus aided Catholics in their efforts to undercut one of the central rationales behind anti-Catholicism in America. In a sixth strategy, similar to that one, many Catholic commentators moved beyond Protestant intolerance to the incoherence of Protestant political power. Catholics used Mormonism in particular to argue that Protestant political power enshrined Christianity, Protestantism, or some form of Protestantism as a de facto establishment. And this, of course, is responding to decades and even centuries of Protestant criticisms about the way Catholics wanted church and state to work together. So here's an example. In December 1871, the editors of the Morning Star and Catholic Messenger laid out a common Catholic critique. They announced sardonically that, quote, President Grant's virtue boils over against the Mormons, and that he declares that Mormons shall not violate his ideas of decency under the cloak of religion. The editors objected to, quote, the assumption of power by a president to decide on the question whether a religion is genuine or a mere cloak. How is it possible for Congress itself to legislate against a polygamous religion without recognizing Christianity as the religion of the country? We cannot see. But such a recognition would be, to a certain extent, the dreaded union of church and state, end quote. The editors concluded that as a Christian, Grant was, quote, not going to tolerate people in being anything else, no matter what the Constitution may say. In the same way, he being a Methodist, those who are not Methodists may look out. The editors clarified that their comments were not a defense of Mormonism. Their point was that Protestants were assuming a legal authority that their incoherent model of church and state steadfastly disclaimed. As Catholics saw it, Protestant reactions to Mormonism pushed the incoherence of that model into full view. Final example here. A seventh Catholic strategy asserted the insufficiency of any possible Protestant response to the Mormon problem. A, because Protestants lacked divine authority, and B, because Protestants lacked moral authority. The most prominent purveyor of this first part of the argument was the great American Catholic intellectual Erastus Bronson. Catholicism, in Bronson's eyes, was not incompatible with American religious liberty as Protestants portrayed it. Rather, Bronson argued, it was religious liberty's only guarantor. The church, the Catholic Church, was, quote, necessary as a mediating power between the individual and the state. With divine authority, independent of individuals in the state, the church could check the power of both, keeping individuals' judgments from throwing society into anarchy and keeping state decisions from descending into despotism. Bronson used the Mormon problem prominently, repeatedly, to demonstrate the insufficiency of the prevailing Protestant model of church and state for such a task. Quote, what will you do with the Mormons, he asked. Suffer them to go on and live and act according to their individual reason and conscience, but that is incompatible with the safety of the state, the peace of society, and the morals of the community. Suppress them by the strong arm of power, but who gave the state authority to decide questions of conscience? Any federal ruling on the Mormon conscience usurped a divine authority Protestants ostensibly denied. Bronson argued, and other Catholic commentators argued as well, that only the visible, organized Catholic Church that claimed divine authority independent of the individual in the state could solve the Mormon problem. Got even more interesting when Catholics started talking about moral authority. Catholics argued that Protestants lacked even the moral authority to respond to the Mormon menace because they were complicit in the Mormon practice of polygamy. Their central strategy here was to triangulate Protestantism, the legal laxity and prevalent practice of divorce in America, and Mormon polygamy. As one Catholic put it, quote, Luther justified bigamy, and our country, Protestant in its tone, legalized it by lavishly granted divorces, so relaxing the marriage tie that Mormonism, with polygamy as a doctrine, is firmly fastened on the land. Sometimes Catholics focused on linking Protestantism directly to polygamy. They loved to harp on the fact that Luther kind of sanctioned Philip of Hesse's bigamy during his lifetime. Let's see here. So they focused on linking Protestantism directly to polygamy. Sometimes they emphasized Protestantism's relationship to American divorce practices. And sometimes they explicitly traced this supposed historical progression from Protestantism to the lax divorce laws in America to a weakened marriage culture and then the resultant rise of Mormon polygamy in America, all traced back to Protestantism. Cumulatively, the effect was the same. In each of these rhetorical schemes, the Catholic punchline was that Protestantism could not stop Mormon polygamy. Only Catholics, unwavering defenders of marriage, could respond to the problem with moral authority. Mormon polygamy was thus a new rhetorical resource for long-standing Catholic contentions about the sacramental nature of marriage and the social ills that followed from Protestant permissiveness toward divorce. But the marriage argument was inextricable from the larger argument, which Catholics rarely lost sight of, and that was that the informal Protestant establishment was insufficient to protect religious liberty from the threat of Mormonism and Mormon polygamy. So to sum up, a widespread American Catholic commentary resisted the efforts of both insiders and outsiders to distance themselves from each other. Normative Protestantism, as Erastus Bronson insisted in his famous essay on Transcendentalism, had to bear the shame of its progeny. By connecting outsiders to insiders, many Catholics countered Protestant professions of their own Americanness, and that Americanness was their ostensible practice and protection of exegetical, intellectual, and religious freedom. In doing so, these Catholics revealed another domain of responsive strategies available to religious outsiders. They used marginalized Mormons to lay bare the mechanics of their own marginalization and to critique rather than appease America's Protestant center. Thanks.